Harumph. These asshats don't know what they're doing. From the very first day that the French paratroopers landed in Dien Bien Phu, they f***ed the dog. They were actually performing an anti-paratroop landing exercise when a disorganized cluster of Frenchmen dropped from their skies. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower. In March of 1954, a cluster of officers crept laboriously through dense foliage at the far north of the valley of Dien Bien Phu. They were all wearing the uniform of the Vietnamese People's Army. However, the senior figure was different in a couple of subtle ways. One was that he was wearing this lapel pin showing a rising sun that none of the others had. The other was that if you approached close enough to hear him, he was not speaking Vietnamese. He was speaking Chinese with a broad northern accent. Friends, this was Ru Fui. I don't have rights to photos of him in theater, but this shows about how well he blended in among VPA troops with his obviously northern Chinese face and stature. He had been an old, long service Chinese revolutionary who had distinguished himself as an expert in long range reconnaissance. He had been doing great things up in Korea when suddenly he was pulled off the battlefield and hustled down to Vietnam as part of CMAG, the Chinese Military Advisory Group. And on this day, he was on a very special and exceptional mission. Normally in CMAG, the first rule of Fight Club was you do not go near the front line, where you could be observed or, God forbid, captured as a Chinese army officer hiding out among the Vietnamese. You definitely did not go eyeball to eyeball with the French Foreign Legion 13th Demi Brigade up at Strong Point Beatrice. However, this day was different because somebody from CMAG needed to go see the preparations for the attack that was coming with his own eyes and make a no-bull assessment about the Vietnamese chances up there, because that was scheduled to be the Vietnamese communist objective in just a very few days. And China had a lot riding on this. Ru, the recon expert, did not much like what he saw up there. Beatrice was magnificently fortified. It had positions that overlapped each other, he wrote, like scales of a fish. And it was going to be able to put up a very stubborn defense. The only way, he judged, that the Vietnamese would be able to take it was going to be to crack open one of these many interlocking machine gun positions and then use that as a point of entry to swarm the communication trenches. And to approach any machine gun position, the assault troops were only going to be able to hide for so long in forward trenches. No matter which machine gun position they chose to assault, at some point, they were going to have to get up, leave their trenches, and just run at the French wire. Hopefully, they would have friendly artillery to keep heads down in the French position. But to be fair, the French looked like their heads were going to be pretty safe inside of Strong Point Beatrice. The only good news that Ru brought back was that the defenses on Beatrice were so strong and so dense that all the Legion was going to be able to do was defend it. There wouldn't actually be a way for them to get out and sally from their own trenches and counter-assault the VPA. That's pretty cold comfort. When Ru reported to headquarters, he told them that they needed to delay the Vietnamese attack one more time after a long, long waiting game that had exhausted everybody on the communist side. Because, he said, once we do this, it absolutely must work. We have to do everything that we can to give this first shot the most chance of success, because if this doesn't succeed, everything at Dien Bien Phu is done. Friends, normally it would be exactly contrary to Maoist insurgency doctrine to roll the dice on one huge strategic gamble that would have your side completely dished if it didn't work. Maoist doctrine was largely about preserving your optionality. But here at Dien Bien Phu, the Vietnamese communists had gotten themselves into a position a little bit like the French. At the beginning of months of planning, they thought that they were keeping their options open. Then they evolved and adapted slowly to changing circumstances and cut off their various options one by one until they found themselves ultimately painted into a strategic corner where there was no graceful or safe exit. And before they knew it, they were actually committed to fighting a pitched, decisive battle that would be a winner take all conflict. So far in our series about Dien Bien Phu, we've talked about the advisors of CMAG, the Chinese Military Advisory Group, to the Vietnamese People's Army. What we haven't yet talked about is why they were sent at all. Why did China care so much about this? The reasons are overdetermined, as academics like to say, which is to say, there were a lot of very strong reasons, all pushing in the same direction at the same time. One was that Ho Chi Minh was an old friend and ally of the Chinese Communist Party. Before he became the bearded Uncle Ho of North Vietnam, he had led a very colorful and interesting life as an itinerant revolutionary. And some of his travels had taken him into South China, where he learned to speak Cantonese. He attended the Huangpu Junxiao, the Huangpu Military Academy, which was kind of like the West Point of pre-communist Republican China. And like the real West Point, it supplied leaders to both sides of China's civil war. Also, Ho had been an early part of the Chinese revolutionary movement, even before he went on to help found the Communist Party of Indochina. Also, I should point out that as a Vietnamese intellectual of that day, Ho could read and write Chinese very well. Remember, friends, that before the Vietnamese language adopted Latin letters to Romanize its language, they used to use Chinese characters, much like the rest of East Asia. So there was a lot of personal and cultural history there. Also, speaking of cultural history, for the Chinese Communist Party, this was a chance now to mend fences with its southern neighbor. This didn't mean that the Vietnamese people would now start loving the Chinese, but it was a way to reduce tensions in the name of communist internationalism, which was supposed to be about brotherhood among the working classes of all nations. Also, there was a practical security related geopolitical reason for this. China would much rather have a basically friendly communist government on its strategic southern border rather than the imperialist French, whom they frankly regarded as merely American cat's paws. And time again in the Chinese documents, we have Chinese leaders saying things like, we'd rather fight the Americans and their French lackeys down south rather than let their noses under the tent and have to deal with them inside our own borders in southern China. Also, China had to be viewing the Indochina War as a laboratory and sandbox practice area for their own evolving national defense strategy. We'll talk about that more another time. Furthermore, as time went by, China had more and more invested in Vietnam. Now, granted, during the Indochina War against the French, China hadn't yet committed nearly the river of wealth and materiel that they would give to the Vietnamese in the 60s when they were straightforwardly fighting the Americans. However, even in the 50s, it still cost China a lot. If you cast your mind back to the earlier part of this course, you'll remember that what was happening in the PLA in the early 50s, they were stripping the cupboards bare. They were literally taking rice out of their own soldiers' bowls. They reduced the soldiers' calories by 5%. And they made them do without practice ammo, all these 1,001 tiny economizing measures that basically undid much of the PLA's plan to modernize itself in the early 50s, in part to help support the largesse that was going down to Vietnam. And as it got closer and closer, the Vietnamese wanted to wait longer and longer to make sure that their buildup was truly complete. At CMAG headquarters, this had been keeping top Chinese advisor Wei Guoqing sleepless for months. Among all the PLA top dogs, he was famous throughout the army as an insomniac. When there was a campaign on, he would go days without sleeping. And in fact, his aides later recalled that they just learned that if they had news for him any time of day and night, they would not do what they would normally do for any other boss, which was make a judgment about how important this information was before they dared to wake him up. They said, with Wei Guoqing, you could go in with even a minor bulletin in the middle of the night. You could barge right into his bedroom and he'd probably be lying wide awake in bed, tossing and turning, and actually grateful to have something to take his mind off of his sleeplessness. Half a year before the French ever dropped into Dien Bien Phu, CMAG was eager to move General Giap's focus up to that part of the country anyway, up in the northwestern Thai highlands. They were advocating that the VPA take time to turn that corner of the country into a peasant haven, kind of like the early PLA had had in the Western Chinese mountains during their civil war. So for Beijing, when the news came at the end of 1953 that the French had actually jumped into Dien Bien Phu on their own initiative, this was wonderful news. The only fear on the communist side was that maybe the French might be trying to lure the VPA deliberately out west so that France could take advantage of their absence from the coast to whoop ass there. So they did some reconnoitering back east that settled their nerves and convinced them that this wasn't a really elaborate trap. And then, right away, they started the VPA's 316th Division marching northwest immediately. CMAG didn't even have a divisional advisor for them yet, so they acted fast. And they asked Beijing for a Korea veteran who could serve as a divisional advisor. So Beijing did its now familiar trick. They went and they grabbed one Xu Chenggong, a 15-year veteran of the PLA who had just finished a very successful tour in Korea, who was back in Beijing for basically some glorified R&R and a staff exercise. And they told him, "Welcome home. Now pack your bag. Don't tell anyone. You are going to Vietnam." And he was whisked southward to meet his new Vietnamese proteges in the 316th Division on the march on their way to Dien Bien Phu. In the meantime, though, CMAG and General Giap's staff were getting super busy because right away they knew that now up in the Northwest, they were going to need not just a ton of infantry, but also a ton of engineers and a lot of anti-aircraft people and artillerists. And it's not like the VPA had a lot of any of those kinds of soldiers. And what's worse, they were moving too slowly. See, there was already a kind of inbuilt problem. The VPA infantry was just like the PLA infantry, very fast on their feet. However, the artillery in the AAA were different. In the topography of Vietnam, they were slow and plodding and row-bound. Worse still, what they were finding was that their roads that they had to travel up to Dien Bien Phu sucked even more than usual. We mentioned before in earlier episodes that in rural French Indochina, the so-called colonial highways were mostly glorified dirt tracks. And now, ever since the communists had chased the French colonial authorities out of large parts of rural Vietnam, the French were no longer maintaining these dirt roads, which were now being quickly reclaimed by nature and turning just impassable. And of course, up till this point, that had probably been a good thing for the VPA, since it helped to keep the French group mobile out of the VPA's backyard. Those French groups were motorized, and if they didn't have roads to travel, that was great. But now that the VPA itself actually wanted to use those roads for themselves, for trucks that could tow artillery pieces and anti-air cannon, now they had to employ a lot of engineers who could go out ahead of the slow-moving artillery columns and improve the roads for them. There was only one good thing about this for the VPA, and that was that their anti-aircraft gunners finally got some practice sighting in on actual aircraft. Remember, they themselves had no experience fighting actual airplanes. Their Chinese advisors had plenty of that from Korea. But for their Vietnamese students, this was their chance to hide during the daytime from the French aircraft that were overflying them, trying to find them and bomb them. And even though the Vietnamese gunners weren't allowed to open up on the French aircraft because they had to maintain security, they could at least spend their days just moving their guns and tracking the French aircraft and getting some kind of dry fire practice on real targets. And that great big logistical challenge of opening the roads and then moving these ponderous artillery columns down them, even though that was the main concern of the VPA and CMAG headquarters, they also detached Vietnamese and Chinese staff officers to rush ahead of the troops to Dien Bien Phu to start getting to know the place. They were basically like the staff officers' version of scouts. What they found at Dien Bien Phu was that even though the French were digging in and improving the airstrip, the whole western side of the French position was open and porous. They even heard a report from a Vietnamese recon element who had been sneaking into the French drop zones on the western side of the valley at night, to steal discarded French parachutes and try to snatch a couple prisoners. This particular Vietnamese recon group dawdled, and somehow at sunrise, they were still stuck on the valley floor, trapped right out in the open. So they hid under piles of parachutes. They spent the day eating French canned rations and taking naps, and then they just waited to exfiltrate by night. So this gave ideas to the Vietnamese and Chinese staff officers who had rushed out there as kind of like the planners' first responders from HQ. They started sketching a strategy of how they thought the battle should go. Their idea was to use a classic PLA technique that it was sometimes called eating the heart out or the inside out strategy. Once the VPA artillery and anti-aircraft forces got there, they were supposed to make a big demonstration. And the ground forces would make a typical PLA type multi-sided attack. There'd be a lot of diversionary attacks on many fronts, but the real attack was supposed to be this quiet stiletto thrust that would go right into Colonel DeCastries' HQ bunker and take him out. They would blow that thing up, decapitate the whole French garrison, and then that commando force would start working its way outward from the center. In the meantime, the infantry from their siege positions on the front line would start attacking inward, and the French forces would be surrounded from the inside. That's why sometimes this tactic is also called the flower petal or flower blossom attack. Starts at the center and then opens outward. These first responders from the planning section liked this idea better than the alternative, which would have been a conventional outside-in attack, or what the PLA sometimes called a fruit peel attack, where they would have to first reduce some posts on the French outer perimeter, and then they would use those as a springboard to attack the inner perimeter. And they would work their way in, kind of like an island hopping campaign, but on land. And so under that plan, you would kind of like be peeling the objective outside in like a piece of fruit. That was what they had tried at the Battle of Nasan. See our previous episode about that, and it sucked for the communist side. They attacked an outlying post, and the Foreign Legion bitch slapped them. They waited a week. They tried it again. That time, they seized a couple of footholds, and all they got for it was a night of shelling by the French artillery, and then a counterattack in the morning by some really pissed off paratroopers. Then they tried it one more time, and the French Air Force came in and gave them a close air support shellacking like something out of the Old Testament. They did not want to do that again. Worst of all was that doing a fruit peel attack from the outside in, doing that the right way was going to take too long. Right now, the French were still digging in at Dien Bien Phu. So the fast-moving VPA 316th Division could hit them as soon as it arrived and probably catch the French still on the hop. But every day that the communists waited was another day for the French to dig, fortify, and plan artillery fires. So the CMAG first responders concluded they should hit that place as soon as possible. And yes, that limited how much artillery and anti-aircraft protection they would have time to haul up to Dien Bien Phu. They were hoping that they could nullify some of the enemy's firepower advantages if they used the eating the heart out method. Because if it worked right, they would be starting the battle with the lines already badly commingled, and that would leave the French Air Force little way to hit communists without also hitting friendlies. Yet another argument they made for going fast was logistics. Already up in northwestern Vietnam, the VPA was eating 50 tons of rice every day. And that was without even counting the civilian porters who had come along. It was going to take superhuman effort just to keep feeding the army long enough to fight the French up there in the middle of Vietnamese mountain jungle BFE. Moreover, the VPA soldiers themselves did not like mountain jungle BFE. They were a flat land army at that time. They liked the plains. They were used to those and they were used to fighting there. The VPA were not mountain soldiers by preference at that time, and planners thought that if General Giap condemned them to a long-term like battle of the bamboo Verdun up at Dien Bien Phu, that they were going to have a lot of diseased, hungry, demoralized communists. So among the Vietnamese and the Chinese staff officers, everybody was pressing for a fast, prompt attack on Dien Bien Phu, except for the one person who really mattered. General Giap himself remained ambivalent about trying to move that quickly. He agreed to do it at first, but he was torn up inside about it. In private, he would acknowledge misgivings. He would say that their artillery was moving too slowly, and they had to have that artillery. Yeah, it was well and good to talk about a stealthy commando attack to take out the French HQ before they knew what was happening, but the French weren't fools, and there wasn't like a Jedi mind trick that would let the VPA commandos go like, these are not the communists you're looking for. There were going to have to be serious protective fires from communist artillery. And that artillery was going to have to be able to hit the airstrip and close it right away from the first day of the battle. So General Giap started pushing back the date of the attack, at first for 2 days, then for 4 days. And as this was going on, we have message traffic from the CMAG advisors in Vietnam to Beijing saying to them, look, Beijing, time's getting away from us down here. The Vietnamese artillery is only advancing 2,000 meters a night. And from where they are now to their positions where they need to be to attack Dien Bien Phu, they still have to cross two steep mountains, meaning this is not going to happen soon. And until that happens, that French airstrip at Dien Bien Phu is just taking more troops, adding more artillery shells to its stocks for those French guns, and the French trench system is getting better and better. So finally, the head of CMAG, Wei Guoqing, the Insomniac, cabled Beijing and said, and I paraphrase, even if communist fairy godmother magicked the Vietnamese guns into position overnight, at this point, I don't think that we could actually successfully sneak in a commando attack that would take out the French headquarters in the middle of the night and commence a true surprise, inside out flower petal attack that would nullify French firepower advantage. Too much had changed by that point, Wei said. One of the big things was that the French now had tanks in there, and that was going to be a game changer for any lightly armed commando raiders that tried to kick off this battle and then survive long enough in the middle of the French position to do real damage and squeeze the French in a vice between an inside and an outside perimeter. That ship had already sailed for the communists. At this point, I think that there were people on the Chinese side who were getting pretty impatient with General Giap. Now, we have to read between the lines here. That's because the documents that we have are quite diplomatic. I haven't seen any place where the principals were writing down their unvarnished thoughts and saying things like, General Giap needs to get off his ass or we're going to de-bankroll this whole operation. Nothing like that. Because remember, every Chinese officer who had been hand-picked to take part in the secret mission began his involvement with CMAG with a very stern lecture from a top-tier CCP official in Beijing, sometimes from Mao Zedong himself, who told him, when you're down there in Vietnam advising, remember that you are an advisor. So anytime you're impatient with the Vietnamese, keep your opinions to yourself. You are their servant. That's the word that they used. And they reminded them in so many words, we are on thin political ice with these people. They are our valued allies, but they don't like us. And if you give them even a whiff of arrogance or Chinese chauvinism or bossiness, they're going to lump us, the Chinese communists, in with centuries of previous Chinese imperialist overbearingness, and this will screw up our mission. Therefore, if we in Beijing have so much as a tingle of an intuition that you are down there in Vietnam acting as anything but the most deferential guest, we will relieve you instantly. And furthermore, even when you do behave yourself correctly, as we know you will, that is still not enough. And so you will regularly perform self-criticisms among each other down in Vietnam about all the little ways that you could have done it better and been more respectful and constructive with your Vietnamese comrades, and how you will be more deferential to them in the future. Got it? That was the mental preparation that was given to every Chinese officer down there in Vietnam. So it's not like they were sending cables back to Beijing that were going like, harumph, these asshats don't know what they're doing. From the very first day that the French paratroopers landed in Dien Bien Phu, they fucked the dog. They were actually performing an anti-paratroop landing exercise when a disorganized cluster of Frenchmen dropped from their skies. No, nothing like that ever made it onto paper, even decades later, when CMAG advisors were giving interviews in Beijing or in Chengdu in their dotage. So all the records are so punctiliously correct. You know, everybody from the Chinese side agreed so fraternally with everybody from the Vietnamese side who valued the advice of their Chinese brothers so much. It's also syrupy that we know that they were actual human tensions and impatience, but nobody's going to tell us about it. We actually have to use our own inferential reasoning. Part of the inference that tells me that Chinese advisors had to be growing pretty weary with General Giap's indecisiveness was that General Giap's own Vietnamese staff officers were outspokenly impatient with him at this point. They were not happy, and they let him know, especially his logistics people, who said flatly, look, our guys out there are already hungry. It's amazing that we've kept them alive this long, given their lack of rations. If we hang out for another couple months, where's the rice going to come from? They were also nagging General Giap about the infectious disease that was taking hold among the VPA soldiers and the civilian porters out there. It's easy for us who live with industrial sanitation and hygiene to forget that outside of these very modern conditions, human beings often get sick just when they move from one region to another. I'm a very weak traveler. I easily get sick in strange countries. And when I was young, Chinese people who were very switched on to this way of thinking would say to me, oh, yeah, you're just not acclimated to the water and soil in this province. 你水土不服. At the time, I dismissed that as something between metaphor and just peasant folk medicine nonsense. But darn it, they were right. And I'm sure this has to do with gut microbiomes and microflora and little local pathogens, all these things that people are more cognizant of nowadays. And I'm reminded of old 19th century bare knuckle prize fighters like John L. Sullivan and Jake Kilrain. And I'm reminded that one of the big jobs for their trainers was just figuring out how you would get your fighter from, say, Boston by train through rural 1800s America all the way to New Orleans without getting dysentery. And it involved elaborate precautions. They would only let the fighters drink tea or beer, not water. They couldn't have fresh fruits and vegetables. Everything had to be boiled or stewed, and so on. Well, similarly, General Giap's logistics people were telling him, we've taken thousands of these Vietnamese peasants who have lived their entire lives down in the flatlands, and now we've marched them up in their thousands to the Thai highlands with substandard nutrition to boot in open air camps with improvised sanitary arrangement. And these people are getting sick. Add to that that infectious diseases always killed more pre-modern soldiers than enemy weapons, and you can see the trouble. All this kind of impatience and ill-disguised criticism and snark was coming in at General Giap, but ultimately the choice was his, and he agonized for days over whether they should pull the trigger and try this delayed, quote unquote, fast attack, or just accept that the ship had sailed for them, back off, and spend a couple months more making a new plan to go in really heavy. In the end, on the day of the scheduled attack, just hours before it was supposed to kick off, he told CMAG, I'm canceling the attack. And here are the reasons. First, we have zero experience in the VPA coordinating infantry with artillery. We don't even have field exercises doing that under our belts yet. If we attack now and we muff that coordination, it's all over. This is going to be the Battle of Nasan again, but on a bigger scale, with the added horror that this time we're not going to be able to retreat because we're burdened with this huge artillery train that we're basically going to be pulling by hand as the French Air Force flies over us and kills us. If that had actually happened, the French Air Force could have just deployed some hot air balloons to murder the retreating VPA from the air. And to his skeptics in logistics, he said, look, you guys are just going to have to deal with it. At least we can solve part of the rice problem with the help of the Chinese. Today, it's inconclusive, as far as I know, how much the Vietnamese really relied on Chinese food aid for their victory at Dien Bien Phu. And this is because since the Chinese and Vietnamese were never perfect neighbors to start with, and then their relations just soured and became downright hostile later on, of course, neither side's historians wanted to give too much credit to the other. And friends, I should add that in recent years, the two sides are much more cordial and they try to be more generous with each other. But the Chinese perspective says that they provided probably over half the food that was consumed by the VPA and its civilian porters and coolies during the campaign. Specialist scholars will know much better than I. I can just tell you that that's the Chinese perspective. So when General Giap finally canceled what was supposed to be that fast break attack that would sweep the French out of their position before they could plant both feet and bowed to reality and said, look, we're just not ready. We're going to need a lot more time. Beijing didn't have much choice by then. They were already in for a penny. They were going to have to be in for a pound. Beijing didn't have to like that, but they did have to live with it. And their response was to invest even more heavily in Dien Bien Phu. And that's how that battlefield became a kind of Stalingrad that was made so big that it had to be decisive. By the time the two sides had invested so much force there, and really put their heads into the other one's crocodile's mouth, they could not take a step back without getting steamrolled by the other one. It was now a win or die situation, exactly the opposite of what Maoist strategy would have called for. But sometimes these things happen and the revolutionary must improvise. And so that is why Ru Fuyi, the Chinese recon expert, risked going right out to the sharp end that day in March of 1954. By this point, Beijing and CMAG had invested so much in this victory that they had to make absolutely certain that it was going to be a great success from the very first shell that they dropped on the French airstrip. And Ru Fuyi came back, grave-faced but certain. He said, we're going to take out a little bit more insurance, but this thing can be done. And Beatrice is the throat to the French position at Dien Bien Phu that we are going to seize and crush. Friends, when we return to the battlefield of Dien Bien Phu, we will look at Strong Point Beatrice and the rest of the layout of the French camp before the first shot is fired. Friends, if you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. You really might visit our Patreon page. That supports me getting a babysitter in here so that I can free up some time to make some more content for you. However, this course remains free to all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants, and I cannot wait to talk to you next time.